In the shadows of London's glittering streets, a woman ruled with a diamond fist. They called her Queen of the 40 Elephants, but every crown comes with blood on the jewels. Before we step into the underworld of London's most feared woman, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's a crime legend, reborn. London, 1896. The city was a maze of gaslit alleys and cobblestone streets where fog rolled like a living thing, swallowing secrets whole. In the heart of Southwark, where the air stank of coal smoke and cheap gin, a girl named Alice Diamond opened her eyes to a world that didn't offer mercy, only hunger, grime, and survival. Her father was a laborer who rarely came home sober. Her mother took in washing from the neighbors, her hands cracked and raw from soap and cold water. By the time Alice could stand on a stool, she was scrubbing floors and learning the sound of coins hitting a counter, a sound that would one day become her favorite music. London in those days wasn't just a city. It was an empire built on class, greed, and crime. The rich paraded in velvet and pearls while the poor scraped through soot and hunger. Alice, clever beyond her years, watched the rich women glide past in horse-drawn carriages, their gloves pristine, their laughter sharp. She didn't hate them, not yet. But she learned something early. The world bowed to money and power, not to goodness. By 12, Alice was already running errands for street vendors and pickpockets, learning the language of the alleys. She had sharp eyes, quick fingers, and a talent for disappearing into crowds. When the local boys tried to shove her aside, she shoved back harder. They laughed at first, until one of them limped home with a black eye and a bruised ego. The streets whispered her name. Diamond Alice, they called her, because she always wore a small glass brooch she'd stolen from a pawnshop window, a fake jewel, but she wore it like it was the real thing. It wasn't vanity. It was a warning. By 16, she'd grown into a woman who walked with her chin high, her eyes unflinching. She had the beauty of a rose blooming through concrete, elegant, but with thorns that drew blood. Men noticed her, women followed her, and when the old thieves and fences of Southwark began talking about organizing a proper operation, something clean, efficient, and profitable, Alice listened. There was a power vacuum in London's underworld. The men were either locked up, dead, or too sloppy to keep the business quiet. Police patrols were getting smarter, and the days of loud drunken heists were dying. Alice saw opportunity in the chaos. Her idea was bold, even dangerous. A gang run by women, for women. Not the ragged girls who waited in alleys or sold secrets for bread, but a disciplined, loyal network of thieves who could move through the city's department stores unseen. They'd blend in among the upper class, dressed to perfection, stealing from under their noses. It started small. A few trusted girls from the neighborhood, women who knew how to act refined and move like smoke. Alice trained them herself. She showed them how to hide stolen goods and false hems, how to feign innocence when questioned, how to walk into Harrods or Selfridges and walk out richer. But more than skills, Alice gave them pride. "You're not rats in the gutter," she told them. "You're ladies of the night, and the night belongs to us." Her charisma was magnetic. Women who'd spent their lives invisible suddenly found purpose, even power. The poor laundress became a queen in silk. The street girl became a ghost in the aisles of London's grandest shops. And Alice, she became their leader, their symbol, their queen. Still, power draws attention, and attention draws danger. The male gangs didn't like what they were hearing, that a woman was running the most efficient crew in the city. Some laughed. Others tried to muscle in. But Alice didn't take kindly to threats. One night, when a rival gang tried to corner one of her girls in a pub, Alice walked in alone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her stare cut through the smoky air like a blade. "You touch one of mine," she said quietly, "and I'll make sure they find your teeth in the Thames." No one laughed after that. From that night on, the 40 Elephants, as the papers would later call them, began to grow. Word spread about the gang of well-dressed women who moved like shadows and vanished without trace. And at the top, Alice Diamond ruled with discipline and loyalty, yet beneath the poise and charm there was steel. Alice understood that kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. The police were tightening their grip on London's crime world, and women criminals were easy targets. So she made rules. strict, unbreakable rules. No drinking before a job, no stealing from locals, no betrayal under any circumstance. If someone broke the code, Alice didn't shout or curse. She'd look at them with calm disappointment, and that was enough to freeze a room. A few times, when words failed, she made examples. Quiet disappearances, whispered punishments. Fear became part of her legend, but so did loyalty. The women trusted her because she fought for them. When one of her girls was caught by police, Alice arranged a lawyer, paid the fines, even took care of her family. That wasn't charity, it was strategy. She knew that loyalty bought silence better than fear ever could. By her mid-20s, Alice Diamond had transformed from a street girl into the undisputed queen of an underground empire that spanned London's glittering West End and its shadowy back streets. Her crew operated with military precision, and their spoils, jewels, furs, perfume, found their way to fences who sold them across Europe. To the world above, Alice was a mystery. To the streets, she was a goddess. But to the law, she was a ghost, one they were determined to catch. Still, for now, she moved untouchable. Dressed in fine coats and pearls, she could pass for a socialite at first glance. But behind those calm eyes was a mind always calculating, always waiting for the next move. The city belonged to her, or at least, that's what she believed, because in the world Alice Diamond built, power was never given. It was taken, and she took it all, one diamond at a time. London's high-end stores glittered with temptation, the kind that whispered promises only thieves could hear. By the early 1910s, the city was changing. Fashion was booming, department stores rose like palaces, and the upper class flaunted their wealth in silk and diamonds, while the poor watched from behind dirty windows. For Alice Diamond, this was opportunity. She saw the city not as a collection of streets, but as a chessboard. Every shopkeeper, guard, and constable was a piece, and she was learning how to move them all. Her growing circle of women had become something more than a gang. They were a family bound by rules, loyalty, and ambition. And soon that family would have a name the whole of London would learn to fear. The newspapers would call them the 40 Elephants, though at first no one knew who coined the term. Some said it came from the gray overcoats they wore, flowing and heavy like elephant hides. Others whispered it was because they moved in silence, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. But to those who knew better, the name meant power, unity, and the ability to crush anyone who got in their way. Alice's operation was simple in theory, but brilliant in execution. Her girls posed as respectable shoppers, elegant, polite, the picture of refinement. They'd enter Harrods, Selfridges, or Liberties in groups, never drawing attention. Beneath their tailored skirts were secret pockets sewn with hidden compartments. Jewelry slipped into hems, watches disappeared into sleeves. Perfume bottles vanished into corsets. And when the job was done, they'd walk out as gracefully as they came in, the store clerks none the wiser. But Alice didn't rely on luck. She built her empire on discipline. Every operation was planned to the minute. Each woman had a role: the distractor, the lifter, the lookout, the driver. They communicated with hand gestures, a flick of the wrist, a glance, a touch of the scarf. Every signal mattered. Every mistake could mean prison. When one of her girls hesitated during a job at Selfridges and nearly got caught, Alice didn't scold her. She took her aside, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Fear is natural, darling. But if you let it rule you, you'll be nothing more than a mark yourself." The next week, that same girl pulled off a flawless heist and became one of Alice's most trusted lieutenants. As their success grew, so did their reach. The 40 Elephants expanded beyond London, running jobs across the country. Birmingham, Manchester, even as far as Paris. Trains became their arteries, carrying stolen luxury goods hidden in false-bottom trunks. And soon fences across Europe knew that if the goods came from Alice Diamond's crew, they were top quality and clean. But power draws eyes. Scotland Yard began to take notice. Detective inspectors started hearing whispers about women criminals who operated with military precision. It didn't make sense to them. Women weren't supposed to be this organized, this dangerous. The reports sounded absurd, almost laughable, until they raided a warehouse in Lambeth and found a stash of stolen goods worth thousands. Furs, jewels, dresses, all traceable to high-end stores. The labels had been carefully removed, the items repackaged for resale, and on one of the crates someone had scratched a small diamond symbol, Alice's signature. The police began calling her the Queen of the 40 Elephants. The name stuck, and Alice wore it like a crown. But being queen wasn't just about leading. It was about maintaining control in a world that wanted to see her fall. Male gangs tried to interfere, to tax her operations or claim territory. Alice had learned long ago that diplomacy in the underworld was just another form of warfare. She formed an alliance with another powerful London gang, the Elephant and Castle Mob, led by the infamous Billy Hill. It was a marriage of convenience, her women's finesse combined with his men's muscle. The deal was simple. They kept the peace, shared resources, and stayed out of each other's way. But alliances are fragile in the criminal world. Alice knew that respect was temporary and loyalty was conditional. So she doubled down on her internal structure. The 40 Elephants began recruiting not just thieves, but seamstresses, drivers, safe houses, even a few men who respected Alice enough to work under her. She wasn't just building a gang anymore. She was creating an empire, and she ruled it with elegance and iron. When the girls weren't working, Alice insisted they maintain appearances. They dressed well, spoke properly, and behaved like ladies. If they were ever questioned by police, their reputations would protect them. If you look respectable, she told them, they'll never suspect your hands are dirty. Behind the scenes, however, her leadership was ruthless. She demanded loyalty above all else. If anyone stole from the gang or betrayed its secrets, the punishment was severe. One woman who sold information to the police was found days later, beaten and penniless, her fancy clothes stripped from her back. Alice didn't need to say a word. Everyone understood the message. Betrayal has a price. By the time World War I ended, London was flooded with desperation. Soldiers returning home, jobs scarce, the economy fragile. But for Alice and her crew, business was booming. The wealthy still wanted their luxuries, and the 40 Elephants were happy to provide, for a price. They began coordinating jobs with precision that rivaled any military operation. Some of her girls became legends themselves: Maggie Hill, Lillian Rose Kendall, Babyface Annie, each with their own specialty, each bound by Alice's code, and still, Alice remained untouchable. Police reports described her as charming yet commanding, elegant yet dangerous. In photographs, she looked like a society woman, pearls, fur coat, a calm, knowing smile. But her eyes told another story, the eyes of someone who'd learned to rule through fear, wit, and survival. Still, behind that calm exterior, there were cracks. The bigger her empire grew, the harder it became to control. New recruits didn't always understand the old ways. Some were reckless, others greedy. The loyalty that once bound them started to stretch thin, and Alice could feel it, the slow, creeping threat of betrayal. The newspapers painted her as glamorous. The police called her a menace. But deep down, Alice knew what she really was, a survivor in a man's world, playing a dangerous game where one wrong move could end everything. The 40 Elephants had been born out of hunger and ambition, but now they were a storm, powerful, unpredictable, and growing beyond anyone's control. As Alice stood by the window of her flat in Lambeth, watching the lights of the city flicker through the smog, she could almost hear it, the hum of her empire below, the rhythm of footsteps in the dark, the pulse of a city that would never sleep. She smiled faintly, touching the diamond brooch that had once been fake, now replaced with a real one. The girl from the gutter had become the queen of thieves, but queens, she knew, never rule forever. By the early 1920s, the 40 Elephants were no longer a whisper in the back streets. They were a shadow over London's entire underworld. Department store owners trembled at the mention of their name. Detectives spoke of them with a mix of awe and frustration. And Alice Diamond, now in her prime, had built herself a throne of silk, fear, and loyalty. She ruled from a modest flat in Lambeth that looked ordinary from the outside. But step inside and it was another world. Plush furniture, polished mirrors, crystal glasses that caught the dim light just right. It wasn't about luxury, it was about control. Every detail reflected her rise from nothing. Every object reminded her that she had won. But power always comes with a cost. As her influence spread, so did the envy. Rival gangs began circling her operations, testing her patience. The police were closing in with new surveillance methods. and within her own ranks, ambition was breeding danger. The 40 elephants had grown too large, too many members, too many moving parts. Some girls no longer followed orders with the same discipline Alice once demanded. Others began pocketing goods for themselves, selling them off without cutting the gang in, and worst of all, whispers began, quiet ones behind closed doors, that maybe the Queen had grown too comfortable. Alice felt it before she heard it. She could sense the tension whenever she entered a room. The way conversation paused just a second too long. The way eyes darted away. She'd built her empire on loyalty. But now, loyalty was crumbling beneath her feet. To reassert her control, Alice decided to make an example. One evening, she called a meeting in a rented back room of a pub in Southwark. The walls were thick with tobacco smoke and the air reeked of gin. The women gathered, dressed in their finest coats and hats, pretending calm but trembling inside. Alice sat at the head of the table, her gloved hands resting on a velvet purse. She said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that silences every other sound. "Someone here," she began, "has forgotten who we are." No one breathed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver compact. She opened it, revealing a diamond necklace, one that had gone missing from the previous week's job. It had been sold privately, traced back to one of her own. Alice turned her eyes to the guilty woman, a young recruit named Clara, barely 20, pretty, naive. She'd thought she could outsmart the Queen. "You sold it for half its worth," Alice said softly. "You didn't just steal from me. Clara, you stole from us." Then she stood, placed the necklace on the table, and walked around until she was inches from Clara. "Do you know what happens to people who forget the rules?" Alice asked. Clara shook her head, tears forming. Alice smiled faintly, not cruel, but cold. "They don't get second chances." The rest of the women watched as Alice's 2 lieutenants escorted Clara out. No one ever saw her again. The message was received. The 40 elephants fell back into line, for a while. Despite the turmoil, Alice's operations reached their golden age. They weren't just lifting jewels anymore. They had infiltrated high society, attending parties, seducing wealthy men, and gathering information. Some even married their marks, using those relationships to access estates and safes. Alice had turned theft into performance art, deception wrapped in elegance. At her peak, she was commanding dozens of simultaneous operations across London and beyond. Fences in France, Spain, and Ireland traded her stolen goods. Her girls were wearing furs from Paris, driving motor cars, living like aristocrats. But with power came scrutiny. Scotland Yard formed a special division dedicated to tracking the 40 elephants. Undercover officers disguised themselves as shop clerks and tailors, watching every movement. One day, Alice herself walked into Selfridge's, the same store she'd robbed countless times. Only this time detectives were waiting. As she moved through the aisles pretending to browse, she felt the eyes on her. The store felt tighter, heavier. A chill ran down her spine. Not fear, but recognition. She was being hunted still, she didn't run. She picked up a silk scarf, smiled at the clerk, and walked calmly toward the door. "Miss Diamond!" a voice called out behind her. She turned slowly, her expression composed. A detective approached, flanked by 2 constables. "We've been expecting you," he said. Alice's smile didn't falter. "I'm sure you have, officer," she replied, handing him the scarf. "But I do believe I was just admiring the merchandise." They arrested her anyway. The trial became a sensation. Newspapers splashed her photograph across their front pages. "The Queen of the 40 elephants captured." To the public, she was a paradox, a criminal and a lady, a thief and a leader. Reporters wrote about her beauty, her composure, her refusal to show fear. When asked if she had anything to say to the jury, Alice simply smiled and said, "You can cage a woman, but you can't cage an empire." She served her sentence quietly, never betraying a single name. By the time she was released, her gang had adapted without her. New leaders emerging, old loyalties tested. But even then, her legend had grown. The women who followed her still called her Queen. The police still used her methods as case studies. And the streets still spoke of the woman who made London her playground, yet freedom brought a new kind of loneliness. The world outside had changed. The fashion was new, the faces unfamiliar. Alice was older now, still sharp but weary. The empire she'd built was thriving, but it wasn't hers anymore. Some of the younger girls resented her return, whispering that the old queen had lost her edge. Others remained fiercely loyal, visiting her often, seeking advice. Alice no longer led from the front. Instead, she became a quiet figure in the background, a mentor, a symbol, a shadow that still commanded respect. But deep down, she knew something vital had shifted. The game she'd once ruled with elegance and fear was evolving, and she wasn't sure she wanted to keep playing. One evening, she sat by her window as the fog rolled through the streets of Lambeth, watching the lights flicker in the distance. She touched her diamond brooch, now dulled with age, and thought about everything she had built, and everything it had cost her. The diamonds, the deception, the power, all of it glittered bright once, but now it felt heavy, like chains around her neck. Somewhere in the city, her girls were still running jobs, still living fast and dangerous. But Alice Diamond, the queen of the 40 elephants, was fading into legend. And maybe, she thought, that was the way it was always meant to end. Not with a bang, but with a whisper in the fog. The 1930s brought a chill to London, not just in the weather, but in the streets themselves. The Great Depression had crept into every corner of the city, choking the air with desperation. People were hungrier, angrier, and less afraid of breaking the law. For Alice Diamond, the queen who once ruled the underworld with precision and grace, it was the beginning of the end. She had built her empire on loyalty and silence, but the world had changed faster than she could control it. The 40 elephants were no longer a single united front. They'd split into factions, younger women, bolder, more reckless, wanting bigger scores and faster money. They no longer moved with the quiet elegance Alice had once demanded. Instead, they crashed through stores, threatened clerks, and drew attention. The streets whispered again, but this time, not with admiration. "They've lost their touch," people said. "The queen's losing her crown." Alice felt it, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. She still walked with authority, still commanded respect, but behind her poise was exhaustion. Every day brought a new problem: police raids, betrayals, rival gangs encroaching on territory. Her lieutenants argued among themselves, each one believing they could lead better. The 40 elephants had once been a sisterhood. Now it was a kingdom divided. It started with Lillian Rose Kendall, one of Alice's most trusted lieutenants. Lillian was smart, ambitious, and ruthless. Too ruthless. She wanted expansion, to move into racketeering, blackmail, even armed robbery. Alice forbade it. She believed subtlety kept them alive. But Lillian didn't listen. She formed her own splinter crew and began running jobs under the 40 elephants' name, but without the Queen's permission. When those jobs went wrong, as they often did, the blame fell back on Alice. Police pressure mounted. Scotland Yard now had names, faces, addresses. The detectives who once dismissed the idea of women criminals were now obsessed with dismantling the empire Alice had built. Every time she looked out her window, she wondered which car parked on her street was watching her. Every knock at the door made her heart tighten. Still, she tried to keep control. She called a meeting, one last gathering at a pub near Waterloo, the same kind of smoky back room where her reign had begun decades earlier. Her girls came, though fewer than before. The faces were younger, brasher, unfamiliar. The room buzzed with tension. Alice stood at the head of the table, her gloved hands resting on a glass of whiskey. Her voice, calm but sharp, cut through the noise. "We built something once," she said, "something that made this city bow its head. But now I look around and see greed where there was loyalty, chaos where there was order." A few murmured, shifting uncomfortably. "You think I'm old," she continued. "You think the world's changed, that my rules don't matter? Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm a relic. But mark my words, the moment we forget who we are, the 40 elephants die." Her words hung heavy in the smoke. Lillian met her gaze from across the table, defiant, cold. "Maybe it's already dead, Alice," she said. The silence that followed was deafening. Alice said nothing. She simply finished her drink, set the glass down, and left. That was the last time the 40 elephants met under one roof. The months that followed were chaos. Lillian's faction ran wild, pulling dangerous heists, brawling with rival gangs, drawing headlines and police raids. The old discipline vanished. Alice tried to intervene, but her influence was fading fast. The younger generation saw her as outdated, too cautious, too careful. One night, one of her oldest allies, Maggie Hill, came to visit her in secret. Maggie, tired and aging like Alice, sat by the fire, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "You can't save them, love," Maggie said softly. "They don't want saving. They want fame, money, noise. We wanted survival. They're not the same." Alice didn't reply for a long time. She stared into the fire, the glow flickering in her eyes. "I gave them everything," she said finally. "And they've turned it into ashes." Maggie exhaled smoke. That's what happens when people forget the cost of power. It was the truth Alice didn't want to face. The empire she'd built had outgrown her, twisted into something unrecognizable. Her health began to falter. The stress, the years, the sleepless nights, it all took its toll. The newspapers still printed her name occasionally, calling her the fading queen, but most people had moved on. The new generation of gangsters, both men and women, were louder, cruder, more violent. Still, every so often, Alice would walk through the streets of Southwark in the early morning fog, just to feel the pulse of the city that once belonged to her. The alleys had changed, the faces unfamiliar, but the air, that damp electric tension, remained the same. One morning, she passed a group of young girls loitering near a shop front. They were whispering, laughing, planning something. She knew the look in their eyes, that same hunger she once had. "Keep your heads low," she told them quietly as she passed. "And if you're going to steal, do it with grace." They laughed, not recognizing her. To them, she was just an old woman with a strange warning. Alice smiled faintly and kept walking. The final blow came when Scotland Yard launched its largest crackdown on organized theft rings. Dozens of women were arrested across London, many claiming to be part of the 40 Elephants. But few of them even knew Alice personally. Her name had become a banner, one used by anyone seeking reputation or fear. She was summoned for questioning again, her first in years. Sitting in the police station, she faced a young detective who looked barely old enough to shave. He leaned forward, eager to challenge the legend. "You were the queen once, weren't you?" he asked. Alice smirked. "Still am, far as I know," he frowned. "You don't seem to be ruling much these days." Alice leaned closer, her eyes glinting. "You don't have to wear a crown to remind people who built the kingdom." The detective said nothing. She was released hours later, but the encounter lingered in her mind. For the first time, she realized her legend had begun to eclipse the woman herself. The queen had become a ghost. By the mid-1930s, the 40 Elephants were splintered and fading. Many members were in prison, others retired, a few disappeared entirely. London had moved on to new scandals, new names, new crimes. Alice Diamond still lived quietly in Lambeth, the city's fog wrapping her home like a shroud. Her reflection in the mirror showed wrinkles, graying hair, and eyes that had seen too much. But in her mind, she could still hear the hum of the old days, the laughter, the daring, the thrill of victory after a perfect heist. She poured herself a drink, raised it slightly to the empty room, and whispered, "To the girls who made the world blink." Outside, the sirens wailed in the distance. Not for her, not anymore. For the first time in her life, Alice felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. By the time the 1940s arrived, London had changed beyond recognition. The rumble of warplanes echoed over the rooftops, and the nights were darker than ever. The city that once glittered with jewels and gaslight now flickered under blackout curtains and searchlights. Bombs fell where department stores once stood, where Alice Diamond's girls had once walked in silence, stealing wealth from the careless rich. The queen of the 40 Elephants had long since retired from the game, if one could ever truly retire from such a life. She lived quietly in South London now, in a small flat with lace curtains and fading wallpaper. To the neighbors, she was just Miss Diamond, the polite older lady who fed stray cats and kept to herself. They never guessed that her hands, so steady when pouring tea, had once orchestrated one of the most sophisticated crime networks in British history. But the ghosts of her past never left her. Some nights, as the sirens wailed and the distant thunder of bombs rattled her window panes, Alice would sit in her armchair and close her eyes. The sounds brought back memories, not of fear but of power. The rush of footsteps through polished marble floors, the glint of diamonds slipping into secret hems, the quiet thrill of outsmarting the law. Those memories were her inheritance, the crown she still wore in secret. And yet, as she watched London burn, she couldn't help but wonder, had it all been worth it? She still heard rumors now and then, whispers about a new generation of girls trying to bring back the 40 Elephants' glory. They didn't know her personally. Most had never even seen her face, but they knew her name, and that was enough. In the pubs and market stalls of Southwark, old crooks still told stories about her, stories that grew taller with each retelling. Some said she'd hidden a fortune somewhere under the city. Others claimed she'd married a police officer and lived a double life. A few swore they'd seen her walking the streets at night, wrapped in furs and mystery. Alice found those tales amusing. "They've turned me into a ghost story," she once said, chuckling to herself. But there was pride in her laughter, too. Legends, after all, never die. They just slip into the shadows. Every few months, one of her former girls would visit, those who had survived the chaos of the old days. Maggie Hill came often, bringing a small bottle of gin and 2 glasses. The 2 women would sit by the fire, toasting to the past. "Do you ever miss it?" Maggie asked once, her voice soft, brittle with age. Alice smiled faintly. "Every single day," she said. "But not the way you think. I don't miss the danger. I miss the silence after a job. That moment when you knew you'd fooled the whole world." They both laughed, and for a moment, the years melted away. They were young again, standing in the glow of London's neon lights, hearts pounding with adrenaline. But the moment passed quickly, swallowed by the ticking of the clock. As time went on, the world forgot. New wars came, new criminals rose, and the name 40 Elephants faded into folklore. But history has a way of keeping certain names alive. Occasionally, a journalist would dig into old records and find mention of her. Alice Diamond, the female crime boss who outwitted Scotland Yard. They'd write an article, usually filled with half-truths and romantic exaggeration. Sometimes they'd even knock on her door, hoping for a quote or a photograph. She always refused politely. "That was another life," she'd say, "and the past should stay where it belongs." Still, she'd close the door and stand there for a moment, her hand on the knob, feeling the strange ache of nostalgia and pride twisting together in her chest. She knew she couldn't erase what she'd done, and truth be told, she didn't want to. She'd lived the life she chose, and for a while, she had been untouchable, and in the darkest parts of London's history, that meant something. The years were not kind to Alice. Her health declined. Her once steady hands now trembled when she lifted a cup, but her mind remained sharp, as cutting as ever. Sometimes she'd take out the small velvet box she kept in her dresser drawer, the one containing her old diamond brooch, the symbol she'd carried from girlhood to glory. It was chipped now, dulled by time, but still beautiful in its way. She would run her fingers over it and whisper, "You and I, we've outlived them all." When she died, quietly, in her sleep, on a cold February night in 1952, there was no fanfare, no headlines. Just a small obituary in the South London press that read, "Alice Diamond, aged 56, passed away peacefully. Beloved daughter and friend, known in her youth for her remarkable spirit." But those who knew, truly knew, understood what that remarkable spirit meant. They came to her funeral quietly, old faces from a vanished world. Women who had once lifted jewels beside her, now gray-haired and bent with age. They laid white roses on her coffin, each petal trembling in the wind. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was heavy with respect. Maggie Hill placed the last flower, and beside it, the chipped diamond brooch. "For the Queen," she whispered. Then they left, fading back into the fog. In the years that followed, the legend of Alice Diamond only grew stronger. She became a myth among historians and crime writers, the woman who led the only all-female crime syndicate of its kind in British history. The 40 Elephants were studied, dramatized, even romanticized. Some painted them as feminist icons ahead of their time, others as ruthless criminals. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Alice hadn't set out to make history. She'd set out to survive. But in doing so, she'd changed the game forever. She'd proved that power, intelligence, and ruthlessness weren't bound by gender, only by will. Even now, decades later, her name carries a quiet power in the dark corners of history. Whenever a woman walks into a room and commands it without saying a word, that's a spark of Alice Diamond. Whenever someone challenges a system that underestimates them, that's her shadow moving through time. Because the true mark of a queen isn't the jewels she wears, but the world she leaves behind. So when the wind moves through the narrow streets of old Southwark at night, and the fog curls around the lampposts like smoke, some say you can still hear the echo of footsteps, soft, steady, deliberate. A woman's footsteps. Maybe it's just the city remembering, or maybe, somewhere in the shadows, the queen of the 40 elephants still walks, watching the world she once ruled, smiling faintly at how it's all changed, and how it hasn't. After all, every legend has its ghosts, and London never forgets its queens.